We've been going through it's just a small series on extraordinary. And if you think about it, extraordinary, it just means outside the norm, what was normally would happen. And you remember a couple of weeks ago we saw the one about Joseph, who basically forgave when most of us would have sought revenge when we had the opportunity to get even with his brothers. We saw Moses when God offered to make a nation out of him, and instead he thought of others instead of himself and interceded for him, and God spared the nation. Or Joshua and Caleb when they basically said, we can take these people and we can take this land and these walled cities, when everybody else said they couldn't. We also noticed David when he was given the opportunity twice to kill Saul, when he came into the caves and everybody was telling him to do so, and he said, no, I'll wait for God and let God take him. And that's also hard. Many of us have trouble waiting and letting God do it. And then the servant Obadiah, when he spared 100 prophets with food and so on, going against what the king and the queen had said, Ahab and Jezebel, he was fearing the servant. But most of us fear more about what the king would say in our own life. So that took us then last week. If you remember, we looked a little bit about the Nehemiah and how he basically talks about keeping your compass. If you have a compass, you can figure out where you're at and you can figure out where you need to go. And if you remember with Nehemiah, there was a problem, and the walled city was down in Jerusalem. He lived a long way away. He started praying for 4 months, and God gave him a plan. And then God gave him provisions, and then he had a lot of problems. He kept turning all of it over to the God. Every time there's a problem, he'd turn it over to God. And in 52 days, they ended up building a wall. And it's not only that, it's interesting too, when you look at it, he provided the food for the people the whole time he was governor for 12 years. And out of his own pocket, never charged them. Kind of a little different than our politicians today. They'll take, but they don't take it, give. It takes us to today, another one I like to think about. Those of you who know the background, sometimes it'll be some of the songs you remember might have hearing when you were younger. One of them has to do with a man who was in the Civil War, was a prisoner, and 3 years later he's coming home on a stagecoach, and he has a girl, but he doesn't know it since he's been gone a prisoner for 3 years, and doesn't know if, so he writes her a letter, and I don't know if you're found somebody else or if you're still interested, but if you're interested, what does he ask her to do? Tie a yellow ribbon around the old oak tree. And when he comes by in the stagecoach, he doesn't have enough courage to look out, and he tells people on the stagecoach, and what do they see? The whole town got involved, and there's yellow ribbons all around the oak tree. It's amazing when you hear some of them. Here's another one for you. 1924, there's an article in a magazine, and it's about a brother who's carrying picking up his little brother, carrying him. And what do you think the caption was?
He's not heavy.
He ain't heavy, he's my brother. Russell, who happened to be dying of cancer, said that'd be a great title for a song, and he co-authored the song. Probably his most famous song. He ain't heavy, my brother. Now what about another one? How about the Gift of the Magi by Old Henry? How many of you know what that is? Remember, that's when you have the young couple who are both very poor, and she has long hair, and he has a watch. And she wants to buy him a chain for his watch, so what does she do? She cuts her hair, and he wants to get her something to put in her hair, combs to put in her hair, so what does he do? Sells his watch. And you think about it, you all know the stories, it's amazing. So if you say you love somebody, what do you have to do? You have to show it. So I think about today, I want to look at about an individual in the Old Testament talking about love and just how they demonstrate it. So if you would, you can turn to the book of Ruth. But there's different types of love, obviously, and we hear a lot of it talked about in the New Testament. In Greek, you have the eros love, which Philadelphia or phileo love, which is supposed to be the city of brotherly love. And we know that's not the case, but that's what it was named for. And then obviously you have agape love. Now, how would you define agape love?
An action verb.
Okay, it is an action verb. It's a noun and it's a verb, but it also, I was given this definition 45 years ago, and I've never forgotten it. doing what's best for another person with no thought of return. Most of us, when we stop and think about it, you do things, but are you expecting something in return? A lot of times we love, but we're desiring to get something in return. But when you truly love somebody, you're doing things that's best for them without the return. I think it's important. So we can look at it. If you look at the book of Ruth, I think you're going to see it displayed very, very well. Basically doing what's best for another. You see it in two different individuals. You have the background starting in chapter 1, in the verse 1 and 2. And if you'll notice, there's a famine in the land. So you have the characters. You have Elimelech and Naomi. They leave. Elimelech, if you look at it, means my God is king. And Naomi means pleasant or lovely. And then they have two sons. It's interesting, if you look at the names of the two sons, what's the names of the two sons? You know what they mean?
Puny and Piney.
Puny and Piney. Wouldn't you love to have a nickname of Puny and Piney? That may explain why after they got married and a couple of verses later they ended up dying. So you think about it, they go just to sojourn in the land of Moab because of the famine with the desire then to return. So then here you have the two sons take wives, and then the husband dies, Naomi's husband dies, and then both sons die. So if you were in Naomi's position, how many of you would think God is upset with you or things are going really bad? Putting themselves, but how many of us read through our circumstances? Most of us do. So here they come, notice then what happens, they both die, or all three die, and it's been 10 years they lived there according to verse 4. So now she's going to return home. The land is back and go back to her homeland, obviously not having any reason to stay. So she says goodbye, and she tells her daughter-in-laws, if you notice, starting in verse 7 and 8 and 9, basically, hey, you need to stay here because you're young and you should remarry and have families. Would that fair advice? This is where you're from, this is your people. Stay here and you're young enough and have a family. But notice then, she also says, hey, I can't, I'm too old to have children, and if I had children, I had sons, would you guys wait 25 years for them to grow up to marry them, and how old would you be? And you're obviously not going to do that. So she is encouraging them to stay and to remarry. You'll notice then what happens in 14, after they've done this, they lift up their voices and wept, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, and she returned, stays there. Which would be a normal response. Notice it's interesting, but Ruth clung to her. Where is the first time the word clung used in the Bible? Nope.
Adam and Eve.
Yes, chapter 2. For a man shall leave his father and mother and
Cleave to his wife.
exact same word. So you think about it, she was clinging to her, she doesn't want to leave. That's quite a statement when you stop and think about it, how she doesn't want. So you notice why she then makes this amazing statement. You sometimes hear this at weddings. Sometimes the wife to be will do this, the bride. Notice what she says in verse 16. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you. For where you go, I'll go. Where you lodge, I'll lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I'll die, and there I'll be buried. And may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me. And notice the next one, she saw she was determined and said no more. Now think about it. She's going back then to Israel. And humanly speaking, what's the chances of her ever thinking of having a husband? Okay, now. She doesn't know anything about the kinsman redeemer. Normally, she didn't know anybody of that stuff. If she's going back, she's basically saying, I love you and I'm going to serve you and stay here. And you think about it, it's quite a statement that she has. And I think it's interesting. She not only says it, but she's willing to do it with no thought of ever getting anything out of it. And how many of us, we verbalize your love, or do you demonstrate it? How many times do people say they love, but they don't demonstrate? So here she has it. She makes this statement. So then notice what you have starting in verse 19 to 22, what I call face value. how would you feel if you're Naomi? Now think about this. It's been 10 years. She gets back, she comes to Bethlehem, notice in verse 19. They come to Bethlehem, which is during the harvest, so the men would be out in the fields. But when they came to Bethlehem, that all the city was stirred because of them, and the women said, "Is this Naomi?" Which probably indicates what?
She looks sad.
Okay?
They recognized her.
They recognize it, said yes. So notice that has her physical appearance apparently changed quite a bit in the 10 years. And you could understand it. If you lost your husband and you lost both your sons, you lost everything, it would show. One of the people that, those of you old enough to remember, that I've seen like aged more than anybody I've seen in such a short period of time. You see it a lot as the presidents, it was that of Jimmy Carter. Just how much he aged in the 4 years that he was in office is just amazing. Which, with that kind of pressure, I could easily understand. So here she comes, and she doesn't. Notice how she sees it too. Notice in verse 20. Remember, what does her name mean? Pleasant. But she says, "Don't call me Naomi or pleasant, but call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." Okay, so she's reading it how? She's reading circumstances, and she sees it. Now, does she think anything about with Ruth? No. So it's interesting. How many times do you and I misread circumstances? Gideon did the same thing, if you remember in Judges chapter 6, when he said, "How is God with us? We're under this great, the Midianites, and how is God with us?" He was in the past, but he's not today. So notice then, I went out full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi? Since the Lord has witnessed against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me. So Naomi returned with her Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, returned to the land of Moab, and came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley season. All right, so here they are. They come in it. And what's Ruth said she was going to do? Chapter 1, she says what? "I'm going to return with you." Okay? In those days, what kind of, if you weren't only men would own the land, so when her husband died and her sons died, there was no claim to the land. So how are these ladies going to support themselves? So that their social security system they had is they would then go out to the field, and they were told not to clean all of it when the people were harvesting, would leave some in the field, and they then could go out and pick up what's left over, and that's what they had to eat. If you think about it, this is what Ruth has chosen. And notice, since she's the younger one, she would be the one going out and harvesting and getting this for both of them. And this is your existence then, and the only thing you know about. Does that show some love? You think about it, that shows tremendous love on her part. Knows nothing about all the rest of it. So she does it, and she starts off in chapter 2. You'll notice she goes to the field in verse 1 to 7. And she says, basically asked Naomi permission to go, and whoever I may find favor. In verse 2, and she goes, and she departs, and she starts gleaning, and she happens to go to the field of Boaz. Just happens to go there. Obviously, you can see the sovereignty of God, those who know the story. And Boaz comes from Bethlehem and basically sees her there. And he says to his servant, "Whose young woman is this?" This is verse 5. The servant said, "She is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves." Thus she came and remained from now until morning till now, and she is sitting in the house for a little while. So she's cooling off. You'll find later in the chapter she goes back out to the field and goes till evening. What kind of weather do you have in Israel? Be a tad bit warm, wouldn't you say? More than likely? Anytime. You go outside, but it'd be warm. It's not easy work, picking up what's left, and she's out there doing it, but she's happens to be there, and she finds favor. Notice then, I think it's interesting, so she's doing her part. She loves Naomi, and she's doing her part. You'll notice then with the favor, notice in verse 8 to 10. It's told to Boaz who she is, and notice what he says to her. Listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field. Furthermore, do not leave from this one, but stay here with my maids. Let your eyes be on the field, watch they reap, and go after them. Indeed, I have commanded the servants not to touch you. When you're thirsty, go to water jugs and drink from the servants' straw. Then she fell on her face, falling on the ground, and said, Why have I found favor in your sight that you have noticed me, since I'm a foreigner? Obviously, he's telling her don't have to worry. And what happens is you can find later the tendency, what would happen, obviously when they're out in the field, so often men would come along and they would basically rape. So he's saying, I commanded them to stay close to mine, they'll protect you, and everyone will leave you alone. Not only that, but here, you can even when you're thirsty, go get something to drink. So being very kind to her. Now you ask why. She asked the question, why are you being nice to me? It's an amazing statement then. What happens then when you look at this in verse 17, Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me, how you left your father, your mother, the land of your birth, and came to a people that you did not know. May the Lord reward your work and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. Why is he doing it? Why is Boaz doing it?
She trusts the Lord.
Okay, she turns to the Lord and she's doing her part. She's working hard, and now he wants to do his part to help her. Nothing has had anything to do with kinsman redeemer at this time. He's just wanting to help her, and she's doing her part to try to do it. And notice then, she does it at mealtime. He even then on verse 14, it's interesting, at the mealtime, he even allows her to come and to eat. And then when she goes to, in 15, when she rose to glean, Boaz commanded his servants, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not insult her. What does that mean? Not just the leftovers. She gets to go and get in. So what kind of harvest are you going to have when you get to go in right in the middle of it? That's the reason why when she in verse 17, she gleans in the field until evening, and she gets an ephod of barley, which would feed both of them for 5 days, roughly. When she gets home, that's why Naomi asked, who showed you this much kindness? Because there's no way you're going to be able to get this much. But it's interesting when you look at it, does she go out and do her part? If you go read on, she goes all the way through the barley season, every day goes out. She goes all the way through the wheat season, every day. Why would they go every day if this is enough food for 5 days? If you have enough for 5 days, why go out tomorrow?
She's gathering for the winter.
There you go. You're having to store up because this is all you're going to have. And when harvest is over, if you don't have it stored up, then you aren't going to have enough. She's storing up for who? For both of them. Because of her love for Naomi, she's doing her part. And this would be her life, the way she sees it, every year from now on. How of us love somebody enough that every day we're willing to do this? No thought of return, going out and doing it. So this is what she's doing. And obviously, when you look down from 18 to 23, when she gets home, Naomi sees it, and she says in 19, where did you glean today, and where did you work? May he who took notice of you be blessed. She obviously recognizes there's no way you can come home with this much if whatever field you were at didn't take kindness to you. She then tells him about that it's Boaz, and then notice then the wheels start turning in verse 20, and Naomi says, well, he's a near relative. Naomi's thinking of what? Kinsman redeemer, although Ruth knows nothing about that. So notice then, she tells her a little bit about it. And notice Naomi also says, it's good, my daughter, in verse 22, you go out with his maids, lest others fall upon you in another field. Obviously talking about with her getting raped or whatever it might be. So it's interesting how God's taking care of her. Is she doing her part? Mm-hmm. Does she love Ruth, or Naomi rather? Yes. And notice now, Naomi is also start recognizing what? Hey, God's still in charge. He's still taking care of us because look what's taking place. He sees this, he's taking care of it. she stays close to him, and notice it says until the end of the barley season, and then when the harvest season, she does the same thing. So you think about it, you're talking about day after day after day. Every day you go out, you get it, you then harvest it, you bring it home, you store it. Next day you go out and do it, getting it every day. And so after they've done this, I think about it, how many of us are willing to do our part? How much are willing to do our part for a couple of days? You know, but this is an ongoing. I mean, you know, you see so many of you have done it with your you know, grandkids and foster kids and whatever. That just isn't one. You know, it's one nice thing about if you're with your grandparents, you can send them home. But a lot of you have them with you all the time, and you're doing a lot because you love the kids. So notice here you have this field. Notice the favor, and you go on a little bit further in chapter 3, verse 1 to 18. Now then, Ruth suggests and tells her about the kinsman redeemer. Now, what is the kinsman redeemer? What is that? Why was it set up, and what is it? Kinsman redeemer, okay, so if a woman dies without having a male child, then the brother was supposed to then bring up offspring from her. This is what happened with Tamar, remember, and the brothers didn't do it. If there is no brothers or anyone alive, then the nearest relative could buy back the field. But if you buy back the field, you're also agreeing to marry her, and then you're also agreeing for the offspring. And if a male child is born, then what happens to the land?
He inherits it.
Oh, they inherit it. So then what happens then? You have to be willing to say, I'm going to take money from my children to buy this land, and if there's an offspring, I'm willing to give that to these people and not to my children. So it's what's right, but how often you're going to be thinking about who? I don't want to do it because it's going to jeopardize the inheritance of my kids. And this is exactly what takes place here. So she suggests to him what to do. It's an unusual custom, but basically talking about uncovering the feet and being there and so on, which she does. And obviously he wakes up and he sees her. And it's interesting in verse 10 when she makes the request. Now again, how many of you would be willing, if you're to Ruth, to do this? You know, you've met the guy, but do you really know him? It's interesting too in verse 10, when she makes the request, what he says to her. May you be blessed of the Lord, my daughter. You've shown your last kindness to be better than your first. Meaning what? With Naomi and now with him. But not going after young men, whether poor or rich. But now my daughter do not fear. So how much older do you think Boaz is than she is? Quite a bit older. More than likely he'd be the age of her parents, or nearabouts. Quite a bit older. We notice what he says then in verse 12. I'll do this, but hey, I'm not the nearest relative, and he has the first choice. I'll do it if he's not willing, but the nearest relative has the first choice to do it, the first right. And so notice it says that he does, and he gives her 6 measures of barley to take home to the mother-in-law. So obviously when he comes home, Naomi sees what is done, and he knows that he will take care of it. And she makes the statement in verse 18, this is talking about Naomi speaking, wait, my daughter, until you know how the matter turns out. For the man will not rest until he has settled it today. That's an amazing statement. How many times you're going to say, oh, I'll deal with it later. I'll deal with it. Notice, he's going to do it today. We will know today whether he is going to do the kinsman redeemer and redeem the land and take you as his wife, or whether he won't. So notice he's going to do it. And you see then, starting in chapter 4, he goes to the city and he tells the nearest relative, in verse 4, to sit down. I've got business to talk to you. And he takes 10 elders of the city. Now why would he take 10 elders of the city?
Witnesses.
Witnesses. You want to have witnesses about the matter? So they sit down and he says, you're the closest relative. Naomi has come back from the land of Moab, has to sell the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. So I bought it, I thought to inform you, saying, buy it before those who are sitting here, before the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. If you will not, tell me, that I may know, for there is no one but you who are redeem it, and I'm after you. And notice he says what? The nearest relative says what? I'll redeem it. He wants to buy the land. But does he have love? Notice verse 5. Then Boaz said, on the day you buy the land from the hand of Naomi, you must also acquire Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of the deceased, in order to raise up the name of the deceased of his inheritance. The closest relative said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I jeopardize my own inheritance. In other words, I won't do it for what reason? Because I want everything I have to go to my kids, and I don't want to have to buy this land, take inheritance, and then give this much to that, to Ruth's offspring. So notice he don't want to do it. So notice that redeem it for yourself. You may have the right of redemption, for I cannot redeem it. So in front of the 10, he says what? I won't do it. So then notice in the custom of the day of Israel, the redemption, exchange of land to confirm any matter, a man removes his sandal and gave it to another, and this was the matter of attestation in Israel. So the closest relative said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, and he removed his sandal. I won't do it. For what reason? I don't want to take money and inheritance away from my kids, but you go right ahead. Boaz was willing to. Notice he witnessed today, and he does it in verse 9. Verse 10, moreover, I require Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of man, to be my wife in order to raise up the name of the deceased and inheritance. So the name of the deceased may not be cut off from his brothers, from the court of his birthplace. You are witnesses today. And all the people were in the court, and the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel. May achieve wealth in Ephraim and become famous in Bethlehem. That's quite a thing. By the way, did she become famous? Remember, how did Naomi said when she came back home? Bitter. It's terrible. And notice how in a short period of time what happens. God was in charge of it. But it's also interesting when you go on in verse 12, the reason they're talking about Tamar is because obviously Tamar had the offspring then through this same deal. But notice in verse 13, Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. He went her, and she was able to conceive and gave birth to a son. Then the women said to Naomi, blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer today. May his name become famous in Israel. May he also be to you a restorer of life and sustainer of your old age. Notice the statement. Your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons. There is no greater statement that could have been made to her. 7 sons, perfect number. Obviously, son would have the offspring you take care of. You're saying that she's better than 7 sons. So you can recognize the people of the city. Do they recognize Ruth for who she is and what she is? And obviously, then Naomi then takes it, lays her on her lap, and becomes the nurse. And who is the great grandson? Then you notice then they named him. By the way, it's interesting. Who named the child? In verse 17, who names the child? The city, basically. The women of the city named the child. Notice it was Obed, father of Jesse, the father of David. The book of Ruth is showing you where he's come. By the way, you think about it, even with the genealogy of Jesus, there's Gentile genealogy even in the birth, talking about through David. But it's interesting, you think about it, was there love shown on Ruth's part? Was there love shown on Boaz's part? You think about it, and God greatly rewarded both of them. But love is something that's so important. If we truly love somebody or love something, then it has to come out in actions. Ruth had no knowledge of this tradition. Naomi said nothing to her about it because she never thought it would ever occur. She never told her to go out and look for Boaz's field. She never thought of any of that. Go out and do our part and let God take care of the rest. I think it's important. When we do our part and we love as we should love, God will take care of the other things. Doesn't mean we're gonna have a David down the road, but at the same time doesn't mean we won't either. Let's think about some applications. Do you simply verbalize your love or do you demonstrate it? In this day and age, we hear a lot of verbalization, but we don't see a lot of demonstration. Do I simply look at the past or present circumstances and judge God of what's going on? Isn't that what the friends of Job did? They totally misjudged, didn't they? You know, God's punishing you. You've got to be things wrong in your life, and in Job's case, it wasn't true. Am I willing to love as Ruth did, work in the hot sun to provide for myself and my mother-in-law? She did every day, didn't she? She had no idea of where it was going to take her. She was simply doing what she could do because that's what she could do to love her family. Like Christ, was Boaz willing to pay the price to purchase the field? Think about it. The forfeited inheritance. He bought it back and he redeemed it, and we have a child as a result. And Christ, has he not bought us too? Christ has bought us and given us an inheritance which we wouldn't have had. So you stop and you think about the story then of Ruth. We have a lot of things that we can relate to. We've been bought back, and we're part of the inheritance and have an inheritance. But how many of us are buying back too? We could be a Ruth, we could be a Boaz, same thing in this story. Just doing our part. But it will cost us something. 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 It will cost us something.